So I'm guessing that probably at some point in your lives you have felt or are feeling limited in some way. And that's why you're here this evening for this conversation. I think all of us feel limited at some point and in some ways. So it's valuable and useful, I think, to have this conversation. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about limits and what limits us in our physical lives, as well as ways to expand those limits. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the spiritual component of living without limits. And now, it never hurts to start with a common definition. So Merriam-Webster defines limited as confined, restricted, lacking breadth, and originality. That just makes me want to burst free, just that definition. And I really want to free that little guy, because he looks like he's feeling very confined and limited at this point. So to ease that feeling a bit, let's look at some antonyms for limited: boundless, endless, infinite, expansive. That feels much better to me, and I hope it does to you as well. So what is it that limits us? Our brains, our thoughts and ideas, our fears and our doubts. All of those things originate in the brain or the mind. And I'm not talking about a higher mind here. I'm talking about this concrete brain mind that we have going on. It limits us. And we may start to think things such as, oh, I'm not qualified to do that. I couldn't do something like that. No, I'm not ready yet. Well, that takes more, fill in the blank, than I can do. Or, I'm really not very good at, and again, fill in the blank. I'm guessing you've all had those thoughts at some point or another. I certainly have. So I'll go to Michelangelo, a quote from him. "The danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark." How true. We're also limited by the messages we receive. We receive those messages from our environment as well as our family. So, a story. I have worked with children a good bit during my professional life and with their parents as well. And so I talk to the parents about the messages that they can potentially give to their children. So imagine a 4-year-old gets up on a Saturday morning, parents are sleeping in, and the 4-year-old goes to the kitchen, is hungry, pours some cereal in a bowl. That's good. And then heads to the refrigerator and gets a full gallon of milk. And then the mother or father, caregiver, whoever comes in the room and sees this 4-year-old headed with this full gallon of milk toward the bowl of cereal. And the first response for most people is, "Don't do that, you'll spill it." And what message is potentially given or received by the child? You're incapable. You're incompetent. You always make messes. You can't do that. I grew up in the South. I'm guessing you can tell from my accent that slips in periodically. And as I was growing up, I frequently heard messages, well, actually they were statements, ladies, and then follow that with whatever ladies do or don't do. One of the things that I heard, and probably other people heard, raised in the South or not, is don't talk back. Don't talk back. What does that do? What is the message? Whether it was the intended message or not, the message that potentially is received is, don't use your voice. Don't stand up for yourself. That's pretty awful, isn't it? Because all of us need a voice, and all of us need to stand up for ourselves. So again, those messages. And so a quote from Malcolm Forbes: "Too many people overvalue what they are not and undervalue what they are." And we undervalue ourselves a lot of times because of those messages that we've taken in, whether they were intended or not. Another thing that potentially limits us is maintaining the status quo. Sometimes the people who love us try to dissuade us from doing things that they think might hurt us. They might discourage us from taking a job or going back to school if we're older. They want us to stay in a safe zone, somewhere where we can't get hurt, physically or emotionally. They may discourage us from doing things like bungee jumping or skydiving. Those are things that I wouldn't do, so that's what came to me as that message of maintain the status quo. Don't do anything where you're falling out of an airplane. So the message that we may receive from that is don't do anything outside of the safe box. Stay in this safe box. Again, limitations. Sometimes we limit ourselves because we want to maintain the status quo. It's comfortable. It's safe. It's known. Okay? There's an old saying about the devil we know as opposed to the devil we don't know. The things that we know, even though we may not like them, are at least known as opposed to the things that we don't know. So we maintain that status quo. And if we've done things a certain way, we just may have a tendency to continue doing it. And we may not even realize that we're maintaining that status quo. We just do it because that's the way it's always been done. There's an old story about a young woman, newly married, very happily cooking a meal for her new husband. That sounds very sexist. Maybe I should turn that around. The husband's very happy to be cooking a meal for his new wife. And she comes in the kitchen. He's making her a veggie roast because we are, vegetarian a lot here. So we just stick with that veggie roast. And so he's making her a veggie roast, and she comes in the kitchen, and he's cutting the end off of the veggie roast. And she said, "Why are you doing that?" He said, "I don't know. That's the way my mother always made it." Again, sexist. That's the way my father always made it. Anyway, you get the idea. So the young man calls his mother and says, "Why did you always cook it that way?" She said, "I don't know. That's the way my family cooked it." So she calls her parents. Grandmother says, "Well, when we first got married, we only had a small pan, and our veggie roast didn't fit in it. So I had to cut the end off the veggie roast in order for it to fit in the pan to be able to cook it." And they continued through the years without needing to do so. Maintaining the status quo, never questioning, just doing what had always been done. So, Sonia Thompson's quote, "Moving into uncharted territory isn't always easy. At times, it is quite uncomfortable. But the rewards that come from exploring what lies beyond the familiarity of your comfort zone are worth all the effort." I'm guessing that some of you have moved beyond your comfort zone at times. Was it worth the effort to you? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Yeah. I think probably for all of us. Ralph Waldo Emerson. "In all my lectures, I have taught one doctrine, namely, the infinitude of the private man." And again, I'll change man to human. The infinitude of a human. So, how do we remove these limitations? How do we get rid of them? First, of course, we have to recognize that we are limiting ourselves. Without the recognition of what the problem is, we can't solve the problem. There is no solution to the issue. So we have to look at and recognize that we are limiting ourselves. In order to do that, we need to learn about ourselves. Going back to that old aphorism of know thyself. Know thyself. So we learn about ourselves through honest, objective self-observation. Sounds so easy, doesn't it? Oh my gosh. Stepping back away from ourselves and looking at ourselves objectively, without judging, without approving, without anything, just watching. Simply watching our reactions, our responses, our thoughts, our feelings. Not only will we learn more about ourselves, but hopefully we will learn about things like our doubts, our fears, anything that potentially can limit us. All of us have strengths. All of us have areas to strengthen. It's inevitable. We all have fears. We all have doubts. But learning about them is essential and part of the beginning of this process of learning to live an unlimited life. Again, we all have strengths. We all have strengths, but we don't always recognize them. Because we're good at a particular thing, and we can do it automatically, we just kind of assume that everybody has that gift, don't we? It's pretty surprising to me. I worked with a lady before, and she could walk into a room of strangers. And before she left that room, she knew everybody in the room. She was as friendly as she could possibly be. She never met a stranger. She was an extrovert. That was part of who she was. And I would say to her, how do you do that? How do you do that? She said, well, it's no big deal. I've always done this. That is a gift. To walk into a room full of strangers and walk out of that room friends with just about all of them. What about someone who's extremely organized? Saying to them, wow, that's so impressive. Look how organized you are. What? It's nothing. It's just who I am, what I do. It's no big deal. It is a big deal, especially to those of us who are not so organized. Okay. It's a gift. It's a gift. Those things that come so naturally and easily to us that we don't even recognize it, those are our strengths, our gifts. And so we recognize them and then we use them, because using them helps us to break out of the fetters, the limitations that we've set around ourselves. Life gives us so many opportunities to use our gifts, and we need to take advantage of that. Watch for those opportunities and then jump in. Jump in. Again, breaking through our self-imposed limitations. Likewise, we all have fears. All of us, we're human. We have those fears. So identifying those fears, looking objectively at what they are. Afraid of failure, sometimes afraid of success, fear of being alone, fear of being hurt, physically or emotionally, and so on. Once we identify our fears, then the goal is to embrace them. Now that sounds kind of scary, doesn't it? If I'm afraid of it, why am I going to embrace it? Because it's mine, and I've created that fear. I've created that fear. So what I need to do from my perspective, what needs to be done from my perspective, is that we get to know our fears. We accept them as part of who we are. We become one with our fear. Once we stop pushing it away, then we can look at it and see where it's coming from and accept it. And then we can move and see how it's limiting us. And then we can move forward. Live authentically with values, beliefs, and ethics that are in line with your thoughts, feelings, and actions. Living congruently, living authentically. There's no need for pretense. When we talk about living authentically, what we're talking about is matching up what we believe, what we value, what we perceive as ethically appropriate. We match that with our actions, with our thoughts and with our feelings. And that feels so good. I'm guessing that most of us have experienced a time when our beliefs, our values, or our ethics didn't necessarily match up with our actions or our thoughts. And that feels very uncomfortable. It feels very uncomfortable. It's sort of almost like a twisting. So in order to figure out, in order to determine what our beliefs, our values, and our ethics are, we have to learn about ourselves, which takes us back to number 2. So it all comes back to learning about ourselves. Because the more we know about ourselves, the more we can identify what it is that's limiting us and then work to break through those limits. Does that make sense? What becomes clear through this discussion is that our limits are self-imposed. You are the boss of you. See that little guy? He says, you're not the boss of me. He's the boss of him. We are all the boss of ourselves. Shams of Tabriz, the teacher of Rumi, said, you must ask yourself, how is it you want to live your life? So consider carefully, what prevents you from living the way you want to live your life? What an important question. And one that requires a great deal of contemplation, I think, on the part of all of us. That boat just reminded me of getting in it and going off into the unknown and living the way we want to live. So who are you? Who are you? You are stardust, according to Carl Sagan, and I kind of believe him. On a very physical level, we are stardust. The nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. That's who we are physically. Physically, that's who we are. And on a spiritual level, you are the infinite, one with the divine. What we're talking about is the you that's inside, or the I that's inside, that's wearing this physical body, that's looking out of these eyes, the soul, or whatever word you call it, it doesn't matter. That within, that aspect of us is infinite, is one with the divine. That's who we really are. And according to Theosophical teachings, each of us is an aspect of the divine. At our very core, we are all one. And we are all one with the divine. I use lots of words to describe the divine, because words mean different things to different people. But what I'm talking about is that supreme whatever, that unknowable, omnipresent, whatever. Whether we call it God or Brahma or the One or the Infinite or the universe or the divine, whatever we call it. According to the Theosophical teachings, that is our root, and we are all rooted in it as one. It's as if the very light of the divine, that white light of the divine, shines through a prism and breaks up into its spectrum of colors. And that spectrum of colors is us. We look different. We appear to be individual and separate. But if you go back, we are one. with the divine. It is within us and it surrounds us. We are part of its consciousness, part of the consciousness of the divine. Looked at in this way, we can understand cognitively with our brains that we should be unlimited because we're part of that unlimited consciousness. But it doesn't always feel that way, does it? So I would conjecture that it is our conditioning that limits us. And going beyond the self-imposed limitations of the brain, it's important to look at the very deepest conditioning which limits us. Many of you are probably familiar with J. Krishnamurti, well known for talking about conditioning. He tells us that our conditioning stems from tradition. Quote, not only present-day tradition, but centuries and centuries of tradition. The whole background of civilization, culture, social impact, and the many, many experiences that one has. We're not even aware of the conditioning that exists within us because it is so deeply embedded in our consciousness. He goes on to say, this conditioning seems to be inevitable for all of us, from the most poor, the most uneducated, the most primitive, to the wealthiest, the most highly educated, and the most sophisticated human beings. We are trapped by this conditioning. And in order to identify that, we have to, from everything I understand at this point in my journey, we have to look at ourselves as objectively as we possibly can. Krishnamurti says that until we understand, until we are aware of our conditioning, we cannot know, quote, the total process of our being. He says that it is the deeper conditioning of the psyche, the inward, that dictates, controls, and shapes our actions. He tells us that a conditioned mind can never find out what is true. It is too full of its own unexamined projections, thoughts, wishes, and beliefs. In the world we live in today, there's a great deal of fear. Fear of the other, whoever the other may be, somebody different from us, right? And I'm not attributing this to you or to you all who are watching on the internet, but it does exist in our world today. There's this fear. Where does that fear come from? Because if we're all aspects of the divine, that other individual is as much an aspect of the divine as I am. So where does that fear come from? Those years and years of conditioning. Okay. That people who look like this, who act like this, who say this, they are the other, and we need to be afraid of them. That is our conditioning. And it's very hard to stop and look at ourselves and go deep enough in to say, oh my gosh, I really have no reason to fear this person. I fear this person because of these messages, or this has been traditional in the culture in which I was raised. This is hard work. Very hard work. Our conditioning defines us. Maybe one more? Yeah. Ah, there. Can't forget that one. Our conditioning defines us. Isn't that kind of how we see the world sometimes? And certainly there are plenty more that can go into that. But this is not reality. This is not who we are. It is our conditioning that encourages us to define ourselves and therefore define others. And this conditioning is divisive. It divides us. It is the brain that, and I know this may sound strong, but I do believe it. It is the brain that lies to us and tells us that we're separate, that we're different. And it often puts us into conflict with others. Because once again, we see them as the other. It is this conditioning that limits us. And it prevents us from seeing who we are, which is aspects of the divine, aspects of the infinite. Well, obviously the question is, can we ever get rid of this conditioning? By the way, this is a picture of Krishnamurti that is on the second floor of our building. It was painted in the 1920s by a member of the Theosophical Society whose, I think, grandson or great-nephew donated it to us. Beautiful picture of him as a youth. Krishnamurti says, in terms of getting rid of this conditioning, it is possible only through watching, not condemning or accepting, just watching the whole movement of your thought, watching the very activity of thought, watching the origin, the beginning of thought. And so, in this watching, the brain then becomes much more sensitive, so that there is a constant objective and subjective relationship, never coming to a final decision. And this requires doing it as a part of life. Our brains automatically judge, don't they? They love to do that judging or categorizing or figuring out how everything fits together. So the concept of watching our thoughts without condemning or accepting, yikes. But it can be done. But it requires this practice becoming a part of our lives. He tells us, Krishnamurti tells us, that observing what is going on in our daily life, quote, makes the brain extraordinarily acute, sharp, clear. And this clarity is really, if we can go into this very, very deeply, is total freedom. The clarity is total freedom. He also tells us that it is the I that is the conditioned mind, and therefore it can't break the conditioning. The mind is limited because it is always seeking, searching, hoping, gaining, projecting, dividing, categorizing. It is not still. It is constantly active and moving. Krishnamurti says, reality comes into being only when there is a total cessation of all conditioning. That is, when the mind is free and therefore still. Sounds impossible, or almost impossible, to me anyway. But from my perspective, as we train ourselves to stand back and simply observe, we are beginning the process of training ourselves. And as we stand back and observe, beginning this process, we begin to see our conditioning. Begin, notice I said, begin to see it. Not end it, but begin to see it. And our minds begin to still. Because we're seeing where this is all coming from. And this will ultimately bring us to reality. Reality comes into into being for us. We start to see the reality, which is not this. Reality is that oneness with the infinite. So why does the brain limit us? It likes the known. We talked about that a little bit. We all like the known, don't we? We like to be certain. This stems back to maintaining the status quo. But we're talking about something deeper here. The brain wants to keep us in those areas that it can understand, that it can process, that it can categorize and label. It wants us to stay inside of the box. It fears the unknown. It fears the uncertainty of what lies behind that door. How comfortable do you feel when you don't know what's going to happen next? When you don't feel like you've got control? I worked as a counselor for many years, and so many times individuals' issues, the things that they were struggling with, came back to control. Having trouble with my teenagers. They won't listen to me. It's because we want to keep them safe. So we try to control them. Don't we? Yeah, it's really controlling teenagers. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Same thing with toddlers, kind of. But look at all the things we try to control. At work, people try to control things. And that control is because we are afraid of the unknown. What will happen if we're not in control? What will happen if we don't wrap our teenagers in cotton and keep them in the house for the next 15 years? Okay. In our world today, there is so much that's not known, isn't there? It's actually kind of frightening. I was noticing of course now I can't call the exact words to mind, but I think it's Santicaro's talk about dealing with anxiety from a Buddhist perspective in uncertain times. Our times feel uncertain, I think, to many people. So we kind of fear the unknown. We fear that uncertainty. We have anxiety because the times are sort of difficult. But really, what is ever certain? What is ever certain? We go to bed at night. We set our alarm clock so we can get up and go to work in the morning. How do we know that will happen? We plan a vacation in the summertime with our families. How do we know that's going to happen? We really don't know what's going to happen from second to second, do we? We think we do. You think you'll all be sitting here when I finish talking and then may have some tea and cookies and then head home. And that's very likely what will happen. But we can't be absolutely certain of that. Every single day we're taking a step into the unknown. Every minute, every second, a step into the unknown. These sort of stretch into some more existential thoughts and questions. And they may require a bit of contemplation. They certainly do for me. They certainly do for me. As I worked with, as an educator with young people who were becoming counselors, one of the things we talked about is how comfortable can you be sitting with uncertainty? How comfortable can you be there? Because if you can't be comfortable there, this may not be a good place for you. What are we afraid we'll lose in the unknown? Have you ever thought about that? We're afraid we'll lose our beliefs, our identity. Most of us aren't attached to too much in this physical world, but I'm guessing that most of us are attached to our belief systems. We're attached to our identity. What happens if we lose that? There's also the other question. What will we gain when we step into the unknown? Eckhart Tolle, when you become comfortable with uncertainty, infinite possibilities open up in your life. Becoming comfortable with uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is possible. Khalil Gibran, self is a sea, boundless and measureless. So how do we deal with, or how do we handle dealing with fear of the unknown, fear of that uncertainty? It goes back to the same thing we've been talking about. Recognizing our conditioning about that fear of the unknown. Okay? If we step outside of the box, what's going to happen? We're going to lose our beliefs. We're going to lose our identity. And for each of us, that fear will be very individual and unique. And then moving forward, recognizing who we really and truly are inside, not this physical body. And then to continue that process, beginning to break the fetters that limit us. Beginning to break those fetters. Clearly, we must lose the I to end the conditioning that limits us in so many ways, both in our daily lives as well as our spiritual lives. While this may happen instantaneously for some people, for most of us, I believe, it is a process. My guess is that for those for whom it happens instantaneously, they've actually been working on this for lifetimes. It just seems instantaneous in this one. Recognition of and then dropping our conditioning is not a small task. And I can't imagine that it will happen overnight or instantaneously. Recognizing the conditioning, again, as I said before, we can't change anything until we recognize what needs to be changed. So recognizing our conditioning by getting to know ourselves deeply, deeply, and then beginning the process. It seems to me that inner recognition of who we really are and what we really are can expedite this process. How we come to that inner recognition will be different for each and every one of us. But if we can recognize our true nature, even cognitively, if not experientially, we begin the process. We start to break through those things that limit us. So here we are, aspects of the divine, living within the consciousness of the divine. Yet, for the most part, we're unaware of it. When we look around, typically we don't see the divine. We don't feel the infinite. We get caught up in our daily physical lives and allow the I, the brain, to limit us. Beautiful picture. To paraphrase Shams of Tabriz, the teacher of Rumi, we are like fish swimming in the water, searching for water. If only we could see it. Losing our conditioning allows us to expand into who we really are. Infinite beings who are one with the universe. We begin to realize that what we are searching for is within us and around us. It provides us with our sustenance and our environment. We are one with the infinite. We are the infinite. You guys remember the story in the movie of The Wizard of Oz? And at the end of the movie, when Dorothy wants to go home, the lion's already gotten his courage, and the scarecrow has gotten his brain, and the Tin Man's gotten his heart. And Dorothy says to Glinda, "What about me? I just want to go home." And Glinda points to Dorothy's shoes and says, "You've always had the power, my dear. You just had to learn it for yourself." And that's us. We have the power. We just have to learn it for ourselves. So let's try an experiment. An experience is probably a better way to say that. If you're uncomfortable, certainly feel free not to participate. And I would encourage you to change any words that I may use in your mind into words that fit into your belief system. As I've said, I've used lots of different words tonight to talk about that supreme whatever that keeps nature going. So what I would ask is that you find a comfortable position in which to sit. It is most helpful if you close your eyes, but if you're not comfortable doing that, then you don't have to. Feel your body relax. Feel the tension flow out of your neck and your shoulders, down your arms and out of your fingertips. Feel the tension, the stress flow down your back, down your legs, and out of the soles of your feet. And as your body relaxes, when you breathe in, imagine breathing in the light and love of the universe, and breathing out the stress and the tension. Let your feelings go. Let them float away. Allow your thoughts to flow away. Feeling yourself fill with peace and love and light. Feel your body. Where does your body end? Feel the skin that contains you. Then move beyond your body, the edges of your body. Feel the divinity, the divine energy that surrounds you. Allow your consciousness to expand outwardly. Beyond the room, beyond the planet, beyond the solar system. expanding into the universe until you meld with it, with the divine consciousness of all. You are the divine, the infinite, the root of all love, all wisdom, all compassion, all consciousness. Slowly begin bringing your consciousness back into this room. Watch the difference in yourself as you move from the infinite to the finite. No judgment. Just acceptance as you move back into the finite being of your body. Knowing that you can always return to that place of infinite consciousness when you wish, because you are one with it. As you slowly return to this finite life, this physical life that we live, I'd like to share with you a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. The world is nothing. The man, or human, is all. In yourself is the law of all nature. And you know not yet how a globule of sap ascends. In yourself slumbers the whole of reason. It is for you to know all. It is for you to dare all. So to close, our limitations are self-imposed due to our conditioning, the I, the brain. It keeps us from experiencing who we truly are, both from a physical as well as a spiritual perspective. Who we really are. Infinite, unbounded, one with all existence, and limitless. Once we know this from the depths of our being, once we lose our conditioning, we will live limitless lives. Thank you. What was that experience like for anyone who's comfortable sharing? Was it useful? Was it not useful? It's kind of hard to tell when I'm facilitating it, so.
So I think it's going to be useful because we were in a different state of mind when we were hearing all the information, and I believe that it'll come back to me when I need it, when I'm going through my changes. I appreciate that.
Thank
I do.
You.
Yeah,
that's very helpful.
Because it's different than having you stand up there and talk versus being in a higher state of consciousness to receive it.
Yes.
So I like it.
Well, when there is no attachment, then there can become the infinite and reaching out. Removal, or first recognizing the attachment, if that will allow for change. Thank you.
Thank you.
My experience was like, starting from who I am and what I am and letting it just expand and expand like concentric circles. So it was beautiful.
Oh, good. Thank you. And thank you for your kind words. And you don't have to say just kind words. I'm literally asking for feedback. So, if it didn't work, that's cool too.
I think for me, when it was silent, I was able to go from that practice of myself to a state of calm and leaving myself and being connected with everyone else here, just in a sense knowing the other and being connected with all the others. And that was in that long silent portion you did. I think that was very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.